Hello, everyone. Today we have an MPP Meet the Author interview with Doctors Cassie Boness, Kanak Kataria, and Dr. James Morris on their early career commentary called Should We Embrace the Term Pre-Addiction? So Dr. Cassie Boness is a research professor at the University of New Mexico Center on Alcohol, Substance Use, and Addictions. Her research focuses on the etiology, assessment, and treatment of substance abuse disorders with a particular focus on precision medicine. Kanak Kataria is an assistant professor at the School of Human Ecology, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Her research interests include addiction, harm reduction, psychosocial aspects of chronic illness, and self-regulation of health behaviors. And finally, Dr. James Morris is a research fellow at London South Bank University, and his research explores alcohol addiction and the influence of stigma and problem framing. So like I said earlier today, we are chatting with our authors about their recent paper published in MPP titled Should We Embrace the Term Pre-Addiction? And this article is part of the early career commentary collection at MPP, which invites trainees and early stage investigators to share their scientific ideas and perspectives. So first of all, I'd just like to ask Dr. Boness, could you tell us about the term pre-addiction, right? What does it mean and why was it proposed in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So to my knowledge, at least as we were writing this and as I had done my own research, the term or the proposal for the term at least appeared in 2022 in a JAMA Psychiatry like commentary, or I think they call it a viewpoint. And the viewpoint was really arguing that this pre-addiction, term or concept was this missing concept for preventing and treating early stage substance use disorders. And it went on to also argue that there's kind of this need or this necessity to intervene earlier upon substance use disorders than we're maybe currently doing, and that introducing this term pre-addiction is the way that perhaps we could help to achieve this kind of earlier intervention or prevention. And they, in that viewpoint, also compare it to the term pre-diabetes and talk a little bit about kind of how that term has potentially or theoretically influenced prevention or treatment outcomes for diabetes. And then that viewpoint was expanded upon in 2023 when NIAAA and NIDA put out this request for information from kind of broadly the community. So, scientists, people with lived experience, community members more broadly, asking people to think about well, first to introduce the label, right? Like, what does this mean? Why are we proposing this? But then also to answer some more specific kind of questions or provide input on specific subpoints. So the RFI really noted that the label, was being proposed for similar reasons as noted in this viewpoint. But then the RFI also kind of expanded upon what was in the viewpoint as well and suggested additional goals such as preventing overdose. So proposing that this term would in some ways prevent overdose as well as some other outcomes. And then in terms of the specific comments, they really wanted feedback on, which we touch on a little bit in our commentary as well, is whether introducing a term like pre-addiction and like in what ways it should be used. For example, should we use it to describe any type of potentially problematic use? So one of the examples they offered was using this pre-addiction label to kind of describe any use by adolescents or any type of risky use. So that's kind of, where it was first introduced, and then also in some ways how it has kind of evolved as it has been, iteratively introduced to the community. But there are kind of two, main sources that describe what this term or this concept is intended to achieve.
And so from a harm reduction kind of point of view, Kanak, how could the term pre-addiction either benefit or conversely hinder efforts to help individuals who, fall under this term?
Yeah, so I think in order to answer that, we need to look at what is it that harm reduction also sets out to do, right? And I think it's got to do with the idea of meeting people where they are, reducing harms and not necessarily imposing the agenda of abstentionism on them and sort of saying, hey, the things that we're trying to focus on here are making sure that people are safe, reducing any kinds of like harms that might be coming their way, and I think principles that sort of underlie that are really going to look at respecting people's autonomy and dignity, and sort of safeguarding that. So I think coming in from that perspective, we also analyze the potential benefits and harms in terms of, first, I think the benefits that are being proposed that it will offer, right? And I think the biggest benefit that they say it is going to have is going to be that more people are now going to be aware of the harms, and more people are actually going to be brought under the umbrella of care. I'm not quite sure if it actually does manage to do that, and we talk about how this might not necessarily be happening because some of the terms to be able to do that actually already exist, and a simple relabeling of those terms and I think the inherent problems with those terms itself and what criteria meet are some of the things we tackle in the commentary. But to simply relabel those terms, that link about how that actually brings more people under the umbrella of care, I think has not really been established. So I think the idea that awareness needs to occur is something that we all agree on. But how does introducing this term actually lead to chances of awareness increasing is something that's not established. So I think in terms of benefits, it probably does not set out to actually achieve those benefits that it claims to. In terms of the harms that can come out of it, I think there is, of course, the harm that comes from the stigma of a label such as pre-addiction, and of course the pre-diabetes comparison is the one that has actually been drawn to say that like look at the benefits that that has done. But we also critique that on many fronts to say that hey, diabetes and addiction are not really similar in terms of whether one is even accepted as a medical disease. And second, that there actually is a fair bit of stigma surrounding the term pre-diabetes as well, and that's actually been documented. So stigma becomes one of the potential harms that comes out of it. Another one is the potential for coerced treatment. And again, like Dr. Boness was talking about, with the idea of using it the way it is being potentially described as looking at, applying to adolescent substance. Does that then open the gateways into bringing people under the umbrella of care where they may not really want to be the umbrella of care? And that would be something that would then sort of go against the principle of respecting their autonomy and, like encouraging them to decide what's right for them and how they want to really engage with treatment if they want to engage. I think another one of the harms that actually comes out of it is that it puts forward this idea that pre-addiction is this stage that happens before you go into full-blown addiction, and it's like a linear path between substance use to problematic substance use to like progression down that line. And I think that line actually is not as linear as it looks in terms of whether someone does actually go from pre-addiction to having what would qualify as a severe substance use disorder diagnosis, because right now what's being proposed is that mild and moderate sort of get relabeled as pre-addiction. So I think putting out this narrative actually that substance use and low-grade substance use is something that's going to set you down this path that can get really dangerous actually does have the potential to make it seem like this is a bad thing that we all need to necessarily be avoiding. And I think that takes away from the idea that stands in the harm reduction perspective that not all substance use is something that needs to be stopped and the goal needs to be for this to go away entirely. So I think it directly contradicts that. It also, of course, runs the parallel, sort of possibility of medicalizing the idea of substance use as a disease, and that's also something where it's hard to do because there aren't sort of equivalent biomarkers that you would require to do it, and I think what that means in greater detail is something that the commentary touches upon, and the potential stigma of that is something we will go on to discuss in a bit. And I think just the final thing is that when we're looking at where our efforts really need to be focused, right, and in terms of resource allocation and things like that, the work that goes into bringing forward this diagnosis, going ahead and sort of, like popularizing it, doing more advocacy around that, are those the fields and directions that we need to be focusing resources on, or rather on enhancing awareness and making sure it actually gets to people and allows them to make more informed choices about what they would like to be doing? I think those are important questions that leaves us with.
Yeah, definitely, because ultimately the goal, right, is to get treatments and effective, therapeutic interventions to those who really want it and really need it. In your answer, you talked a little bit about stigma. So I'd like to ask Dr. Morris, Kanak just mentioned stigma, and in the paper you also touch on it. Could you elaborate on how implementing this term, pre-addiction, might exacerbate already existing stigma for those with substance abuse disorders?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, absolutely. Kirk's kind of highlighted, I think, a lot of the key issues around potential pitfalls, and I guess there's kind of two ways to unpick the question of, pre-addiction as a term or concept, implications for stigma. I guess one is to say, does it have potential to like destigmatize addiction? And I think that's an empirical question, and we can look to existing evidence around what has and hasn't really worked to reduce addiction stigma. And this also relates to the idea of kind of addiction as a disease concept, and it's ostensibly like kind of rational or appealing in a sense that a disease attribution or even a pre-addiction term might have some kind of way of reducing addiction stigma, because a disease model kind of in theory reduces stigma primarily by removing blame from the person. And pre-addiction might kind of, the original authors, McCallan and colleagues, argue that pre-addiction focuses the problem on the addiction rather than the person. So these are both kind of ostensibly logical arguments. But when we look to the sort of empirical evidence, unfortunately, despite rising disease attribution, so we've seen trends over several decades of more people identifying addiction or attributing it to a kind of disease etiology or pathology, if you like. But we haven't seen falls in kind of the public stigma, the stigma that the public hold in terms of their attitudes and stereotypes towards people with addiction. So I think it's really important that when we look at claims or kind of questions of kind of what might fuel or reduce stigma, that we kind of look to the available empirical evidence. And it's always often is with these things, kind of complicated, and often there's kind of mixed blessings or double-edged swords in any kind of attribution or model. And disease model actually does tend to reduce blame. That people have do kind of say, well, yeah, if the addiction is due to a disease, then they're less to blame. But it also is associated with increased other aspects of stigma, particularly what's kind of termed prognostic pessimism. So the idea that people don't recover or recovery is really difficult. It's also associated with more fear and more social distance, so more desire to kind of keep people with addiction away. So it's really important that we kind of look to the evidence for what will reduce or does kind of reduce stigma in these kind of domains. And yeah, I just don't think there's any real supporting evidence that that kind of use of this term and all the kind of issues that have been raised previously with it will do that. Rather, the evidence kind of points to things like promoting prognostic optimism. So really, when we instill belief that change is possible and that people do recover, and that most people recover without treatment, and like humanizing narratives as well, that really, rather than focus on ideas of addiction or pre-addiction, we kind of humanize these experiences and help people to understand that these are kind of lived experiences where life is difficult and addiction problems are kind of a consequence, or in many ways arguably a legitimate coping mechanism to the difficulties that people face. So yeah, I think it's inevitably so complicated when we look at kind of different attributions and labels and understandings. But yeah, generally I'd kind of call to the evidence base and say what we do know is effective in reducing addiction stigma doesn't really seem to align with the idea of introducing a concept of pre-addiction.
Thank you so much to all of the authors for taking the time to speak with us today. Really appreciated your time and chatting with you. If you haven't already, please check out the early career commentary collection, as well as the article featured in this interview in the video description below, and reach out on Twitter if you have any questions. Thank you.